You step into the andron, the men's quarter of an Athenian house, just as dusk surrenders to night. The air is thick with wine fumes, and burning oil lamps flicker across frescoed walls depicting scenes you were never meant to witness. Around you, the city's most celebrated men recline on cushions, their faces flushed, their laughter growing louder. A young boy, no older than 13, moves between them with a wine jug, his eyes carefully lowered. When one of the men reaches out to stroke his thigh, no one intervenes. No one even pauses their conversation. This is Athens, the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and Western civilization. And this is its most carefully guarded secret, a system of sexual relations so embedded in daily life, so normalized in law and custom that to question it would be to question the very foundations of Greek culture itself. If you're fascinated by the hidden corners of history, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're listening from. I'm constantly amazed by how many of us, scattered across continents and time zones, share this hunger to understand what really happened in the past. Beyond the sanitized versions we were taught, here is the paradox that haunts every examination of ancient Greece. The same civilization that gave us Socratic dialogue, tragic drama, and the concept of rational inquiry also practiced a form of institutionalized pederasty that would be prosecuted as criminal abuse in every modern nation. The same minds that conceived democracy ruled by the people saw nothing contradictory in a sexual economy where adult male citizens held absolute erotic authority over women, slaves, and adolescent boys. We celebrate the Parthenon while averting our eyes from what occurred in the symposia held in its shadow. The historical record leaves no ambiguity, from the poetry of Theognis to the dialogues of Plato, from the legislation of Solon to the pottery that decorated every aristocratic household. The evidence is overwhelming and explicit. Greek sexual culture was not an accidental byproduct of their society. It was structural, systematic, and central to how they understood citizenship, masculinity, and power itself. To be a Greek man of standing meant to penetrate, never to be penetrated. To be young, foreign, female, or enslaved meant to occupy the opposite position. This was not merely custom, this was cosmology. The sources are abundant and unsettling. Pausanias, writing in the 2nd century CE, describes sacred sites where erased adult male lovers dedicated offerings alongside their eromenos, their adolescent beloveds. Athenaeus compiled volumes of symposiastic practices, including detailed protocols for how young cupbearers were to be approached, courted, and eventually initiated into sexual relations. The playwrights Aristophanes, Euripides, even the tragic Sophocles wove these relationships into their narratives as naturally as they mentioned bread or wine. And the pottery, the kylix, and amphora that survive in museum collections across Europe depict in explicit detail what written sources only hint at: courtship scenes, pursuit scenes, and consummation scenes involving bearded men and unbearded youths. What emerges from this archive is not a society that tolerated an occasional transgression, but one that had codified an entire sexual system, complete with rituals of initiation, gift-giving protocols, acceptable ages of approach, and even religious justification. The gods themselves, after all, had set the precedent. Zeus and Ganymede, Apollo and Hyacinthus, Poseidon and Pelops. If the divine order included such pairings, how could mortal arrangements be deemed wrong? To understand the scale of this practice is to confront the scope of Greek social architecture. Pederasty was not confined to a marginal subculture or a secretive elite. It permeated the gymnasia where young men trained, the symposia where poetry was recited, the military units that defended the polis, and the philosophical schools that claimed to pursue truth. In Sparta, the agoge, the brutal military education system, formally incorporated older warriors as mentors and lovers to younger trainees. The relationship was understood as pedagogical, a transfer of virtue and courage through bonds that were simultaneously intellectual, emotional, and physical. In Thebes, the sacred band, an elite military unit of 300 soldiers, was organized explicitly into pairs of lovers, on the theory that men would fight more fiercely to protect those with whom they shared erotic bonds. The historian Xenophon, hardly a marginal voice, described these arrangements with clinical precision. He outlined how a young man of good family would be observed in the gymnasium, his physical beauty and emerging virtue noted by older citizens. A period of formal courtship would follow gifts of game birds, hunting dogs, or athletic equipment. The youth's family, far from objecting, would evaluate potential suitors based on social standing and reputation. If the match was deemed appropriate, the relationship would proceed. The Erastes gained social prestige, demonstrating his capacity to cultivate excellence in the next generation. The Eromenos received protection, education, and entry into elite networks that would shape his entire adult life. The scale was staggering. In Athens alone, with a citizen population of perhaps 30,000 adult males, thousands of such pairings existed simultaneously. Every aristocratic household expected that sons would be courted, that fathers had themselves been courted, that the cycle would continue generation after generation. The practice was so normalized that Greek had developed an extensive vocabulary to describe it. Erastes and Ereminos, paiderastia, and pedophilia kalos inscriptions on pottery, praising beautiful boys by name. They could not look away because there was nothing from which to avert their gaze. This was simply how society functioned, how masculinity was transmitted, how the social order reproduced itself. The mechanisms of this system were elaborate, governed by unwritten but strictly enforced protocols. The initial approach was ritualized, almost formulaic. An adult male, typically between 25 and 40, would signal his interest through public gestures. He might linger at the gymnasium to watch a particular youth train, positioning himself where his gaze would be noticed. He might commission a potter to inscribe a drinking cup with the phrase "Kalos Beautiful," followed by the youth's name, then ensure the cup circulated at symposia. These were not covert advances, but public declarations, witnessed and evaluated by the community. The youth, for his part, was expected to display a careful modesty. To appear too eager was to risk being labeled as shameless, as one who desired the passive role rather than merely accepting it as a stage in his maturation. To refuse entirely, however, could signal arrogance or an unwillingness to participate in the social fabric. The ideal Ereminos navigated a narrow channel, receptive but not lustful, honored by attention but not seeking it, compliant but not degraded. The entire community watched this dance, assessing whether both parties maintained proper decorum. Plato's Symposium, perhaps the most celebrated meditation on love in Western literature, takes place at precisely such an event. The dialogue unfolds at a private drinking party where Athens' intellectual elite Socrates, the playwright Agathon, the politician Alcibiades, discourse on the nature of Eros. Alcibiades himself, now an adult, recounts his own youth as Socrates' Ereminos, describing how the philosopher, uniquely among Athenians, refused to consummate their relationship sexually. This refusal, Alcibiades suggests, was extraordinary precisely because the expectation was otherwise universal. The dialogue treats pederastic relationships not as a topic requiring justification, but as the primary model through which philosophical eros could be understood. Gift exchange was central. The Erasts would present carefully chosen items: a hare, symbolizing the chase; a rooster, representing aggressive masculinity; a lyre, suggesting cultural refinement. These gifts were public, often presented at the gymnasium, where other men would witness and evaluate their appropriateness. The family of the youth would receive the Erases at home, assessing his character and intentions. If the courtship progressed, the relationship would become acknowledged, even semi-formalized. The youth might accompany his lover to symposia, reclining beside him, serving wine, listening to philosophical discourse. But beneath the veneer of pedagogical mentorship lay a stark reality. This was an exchange in which one party held all structural power and the other held none. The Ereminos could not refuse without social consequences. He could not set terms, could not demand reciprocity, could not exit the arrangement without risking his future standing in the community. The relationship was meant to be temporary, ideally ending when the youth's beard began to grow, signaling his transition to adult masculinity, but during its course, his body was understood as being at his lover's disposal. Greek moral philosophy agonized over the proper conduct of the Erasts, whether he should be gentle or assertive, patient or demanding. It rarely considered what the Ereminos himself might desire beyond the honor of being chosen. One figure illuminates this system with particular clarity: Alcibiades, ward of Pericles, student of Socrates, one of the most controversial figures in Athenian history. Born into aristocratic wealth around 450 BCE, Alcibiades was renowned for his extraordinary beauty even as a child. Ancient sources describe how adult men would crowd the gymnasium when he trained, vying for his attention, showering him with gifts and propositions. His guardian Pericles had to intervene repeatedly to manage the flood of suitors. The young Alcibiades occupied a precarious position, desired by many. Claimed by none, his erotic capital, simultaneously his greatest asset and his greatest vulnerability. Plutarch recounts an incident from Alcibiades' youth that reveals the predatory dynamics lurking beneath aristocratic courtesy. An admirer, arriving at the boy's home to present a gift, found Alcibiades playing dice with friends. When the youth ignored him, the rejected suitor left in humiliation. The story circulated through Athens as an example of Alcibiades' arrogance, but it also exposed the expectation that a boy of his status should make himself available for adult male attention. His refusal was noteworthy precisely because it was rare. As Alcibiades matured, he weaponized his erotic appeal. He entered relationships with multiple prominent Athenians simultaneously, including Socrates, playing them against each other, using the social capital of being desired to advance his political ambitions. In the Symposium, the adult Alcibiades describes how he once attempted to seduce Socrates, stripping naked and lying beside the philosopher through an entire night, only to be rejected. The scene is often read as evidence of Socrates' virtue, but it also reveals Alcibiades' internalized understanding that his body was a tool of exchange, that erotic surrender was how one gained access to power and knowledge. The consequences for Alcibiades were profound. His beauty became inseparable from his political identity. When he addressed the assembly, citizens evaluated not just his arguments, but his physical presence, his desirability, his erotic history. when he later betrayed Athens, defecting to Sparta, then Persia, then returning to seek reconciliation, his sexual reputation followed him. Enemies used his youthful relationships as evidence of moral corruption, claiming that one who had occupied the passive role could never be trusted with active power. The gift of beauty that had opened every door in his youth became, in maturity, a source of suspicion and resentment. They could not look away from Alcibiades, not because he was anomalous, but because he was exemplary, the perfect product of a system that groomed aristocratic boys for public life through private sexual initiation. His trajectory from desired youth to ambitious adult, from object to subject, from Arimenos to arrests, traced the arc every well-born Athenian male was expected to follow. That the journey left him psychologically fractured, unable to sustain loyalty or trust, was not seen as an indictment of the system, but as a failure of his particular character. Yet Alcibiades was hardly unique. Consider the case of Timarchus, prosecuted in 346 BCE by the orator Aeschines. Timarchus, a prominent politician, was accused of having prostituted himself in his youth, not of having participated in pederastic relationships, which were acceptable, but of having done so promiscuously with multiple partners for money rather than honor. The trial became a referendum on the boundary between acceptable and shameful pederasty. Aeschines argued that Timarchus, by commodifying his body, had forfeited his right to speak in the assembly. The prosecution succeeded. Timarchus was stripped of civic rights, his political career destroyed. Not because he had been penetrated as a youth, but because he had been penetrated incorrectly, by too many for the wrong reasons. The trial transcript, preserved in Aeschines' oration against Timarchus, provides a window into the regulatory mechanisms governing sexual relations. Athenian law did not prohibit pederasty, but sought to distinguish its honorable from its shameful forms. A relationship between a respectable Erastes and a single Arimenos, conducted with the family's knowledge, was celebrated. The same physical acts performed with multiple partners or in exchange for direct payment were criminalized. The issue was not consent. The concept barely existed in this framework, but status preservation. The system required that young men of good family eventually transition into active citizenship, and that transition required erasing, or at least euphemizing, their youthful passivity. Men like Timarchus, whose sexual history was too public, too commercial, too unambiguous, threatened the fiction that respectable youths had been mentored rather than used. The psychological aftermath for individuals who passed through this system is difficult to reconstruct with precision, but traces survive in unexpected places. Greek tragedy, despite its focus on mythic themes, repeatedly returns to stories of sexual violation, generational trauma, and the corruption of youth. Euripides' Ion centers on a young temple servant who discovers he is the product of Apollo's rape of a mortal woman. Sophocles' Oedipus hinges on a sexual transgression that pollutes an entire city. These plays were performed at religious festivals, attended by the same men who participated in symposiastic pederasty. The audience watched dramas of sexual trauma unfold on stage while living within a social system that normalized sexual asymmetry. The contradiction appears not to have registered as contradiction. Myth was myth, custom was custom. The boundaries remained impermeable. One artifact survives that distills the entire system into a single object, a red figure, Kylix, dated to approximately 480 BCE, now housed in the Louvre. On its exterior, painted in meticulous detail, is a courtship scene. An adult man, bearded and robed, extends a dead hair toward a nude youth. The youth looks away modestly, but his hand reaches toward the gift. Between them, an inscription: "The boy is beautiful." Inside the cup, visible only when the wine is drained, is a second image, the same figures in an embrace, the man's hand on the youth's genitals. The youth's face now turned upward, passive, accepting. The cup's structure enacts the progression of the relationship public courtship on the outside, private consummation within. It also enacts the drinker's journey from observing the ritual to participating in it, from spectator to actor. This cup was not unique. Hundreds of similar vessels survive, each depicting variations on the same theme. They adorned symposia across the Greek world, passed from hand to hand, admired for their artistry, their explicit imagery provoking no scandal. They could not look away because the cups were designed to be looked at, to be held, to be used. The erotic imagery was not transgressive decoration, but pedagogical illustration. Reinforcing the scripts both men and youths were expected to follow. The consequences of this system extended far beyond individual relationships. Greek attitudes toward women, toward slaves, toward conquered populations were all shaped by an erotic economy that valorized penetration and stigmatized receptivity. To be feminized, to occupy the passive position, was the ultimate degradation, reserved for those without civic standing. Women, regardless of their virtue or family status, were by definition penetrable. Slaves, regardless of their skills or intelligence, were available for use. Prisoners of war could be sexually humiliated as a demonstration of conquest. The Athenian general, Nicias, during the Sicilian expedition, witnessed his soldiers gang-rape captured enemies, an act his biographer Plutarch records without moral comment as though it were as natural as looting or killing. The erotics of dominance shaped not only private relationships, but imperial politics. When Athens built the Delian League, transforming allies into subjects, writers used openly sexual metaphors: Athens as the penetrating force, the allies as recipients. After Sparta's victory in the Peloponnesian War, some commanders even spoke of violating Athens as both an act of conquest and humiliation. In Greek thought, the language of power and the language of sex often merged until violence and eros became two sides of the same social logic. Yet within this system, there were moments that complicate the narrative. Theognis of Megara wrote elegies to his beloved Cernus, mourning the boy's growing independence with a tone more vulnerable than predatory. "I gave you wings," he writes, "and now you fly beyond my reach." Whether this reflects genuine emotion or refined possessiveness is impossible to know. But it shows that some men understood these relationships through an emotional lens. Socrates offered another variation. In Plato and Xenophon, he advocates a form of paiderasty, centered on intellectual and moral development rather than physical gratification. He surrounded himself with young men, debated endlessly, and claimed to love them, yet a love aimed at the soul. Still, he participated in the same structures: gymnasia, beauty contests of youth, rituals of Erastes and Eromenos. His approach sublimated desire, but did not dismantle the system that produced it. For centuries, European scholars, especially in Victorian and early modern contexts, romanticized Greek love, seeing it as noble, even idealized. Only recently have historians reframed Greek pederasty as institutionalized abuse, examining its connections to power, consent, misogyny, and cycles of grooming. This leaves a difficult paradox. Greek culture produced philosophy, drama, and political theory, while normalizing practices we now recognize as harmful. The brilliance and the brutality emerged together, inseparable. The symposium, the gymnasium, the pottery, they were all public, accepted, woven into daily life. In that lamplit andron, contradictions gather like smoke. The young cupbearer moves between reclining men, his future shaped by customs he did not choose, while history watches, refusing to forget what they accepted as ordinary.